BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Thursday, and on Thursdays this year I've been doing something called the Versus series here on this channel, where I look at two major criminals, usually serial killers, and doing a psychological comparing and contrasting, if you will. Some of the recent episodes have included the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and what you guys wanted to hear about the most in my polling question, the Long Island serial killer. That is why I chose to incorporate the Long Island serial killer in today's episode, and I also wanted to talk about the Stone Cold Killer Arthur Bomar. But before we begin, I would like to remind you guys that I am also the host of the program Astro Psych 400. It's a different YouTube channel, actually. But some people were saying that they use this channel, BlackBoxOnlineRadio, as a way to fall asleep at night, so I thought, why not create a program that is specifically customized to help people fall asleep, and you can find the podcast for sleep on Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And another way to support both channels is to go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise, and remember, being weird is not a crime. Today we're going to talk about the Stone Cold Killer and the Long Island serial killer, but I do need to provide one condition, so to speak, and that is Arthur Bomar was captured, convicted, and the name the Stone Cold Killer was something that was used at the end of a Forensic Files episode. He wasn't super commonly known as the Stone Cold Killer. Maybe you could say that that is a name that wasn't completely attached to him, but I learned about him from that episode of Forensic Files, and at the end they referred to him as a Stone Cold Killer, so I thought that it was appropriate. But with the Long Island serial killer, there's a very big difference, because the Long Island serial killer was not only never convicted, but never identified, so there are certain psychological similarities and differences that we can view. The Long Island serial killer was operating perhaps as early as 1996, and maybe operating as late as 2011, 2012. We aren't completely sure, because unlike some serial killers such as Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer, the Long Island serial killer isn't trying to be some type of braggadocio where there's this three-way relationship created among the media, the police officers, and the killer himself. The Long Island serial killer started out by mutilating the victims in a very heinous way, and for a long time the authorities suspected that there was a single serial killer operating known as the Manorville Butcher, where some victims were even decapitated, and then there are possible victims such as the Peaches Jane Doe and the Cherries Jane Doe, who, as I said, have been decapitated, and they think that the Long Island serial killer could be a very plausible suspect, but they are unconfirmed victims. Shannon Gilbert, perhaps the most famous victim in this case, is also an unconfirmed victim of the Long Island serial killer. But with Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer, I would actually like to go over to an article that was posted on the War Report Online. This is a very inconsistent article. The facts are all over the map, really. But I wanted to read it because they did bring up certain social questions that I think I would like to respond to. And the first is, let's just go to the beginning, actually. Most people who have been cleared of all previous convictions would think to start a new, fresh life, but some people just can't seem to go back to the old and terrible habits. This is the case of Arthur Bomar, who could not help but carry out atrocious acts even while he was on parole for a previous crime. The first horrible crime that Arthur Bomar had committed was an act of murder. In 1979, he brutally murdered a police officer named Larry Carrier in the state of Nevada. When convicted of the murder, Arthur Bomar had pled guilty and was serving 11 years in prison and then granted parole. And they talked about this on Forensic Files as well. The reason he was able to be eligible for parole is, even though he had murdered a police officer, he had agreed to plead guilty to a lower charge of manslaughter as opposed to first-degree murder. And he served 11 years in prison, and then, as you heard there, was granted parole. And the point that I wanted to respond to was this section here in the article. Now, one would think that after serving such a long sentence, this individual would have at least made some effort into getting his life back together, but this was far from the actual reality of what Arthur Bomar did after leaving prison. And yes, Arthur Bomar went on to commit additional crimes. A commonality among between the Long Island serial killer and Arthur Bomar is we aren't necessarily sure how many people he actually murdered. It's highly possible that he committed additional crimes, but he would go on to commit murder again, and thus becoming a serial killer. But with the social question, why wouldn't somebody make a bigger effort to try and get their life on track? I think that a lot of it is resentment. I think a lot of it is the blame game. And when you read other articles about Arthur Bomar, there's so much of this discussion about how his defense was he came from a life of poverty, he had a terrible childhood, he was a victim of abuse, and I think that it's just that. No matter how many years he would have spent in prison, I don't think he ever would have broken free from that mold where there's this belief system that some criminals have that they had terrible experiences when they were young. They were born into this world of misery, so they now want to create misery for other people. They believe that there is some type of justification for their wrongdoings, for their illegal actions, even if it is to the level of murder or rape or torture. And we see this very clearly in the case of Lamarcus Davidson, who was the ringleader of the Knoxville Nightmare, which saw the murders of Channing Christian and Christopher Newsom, where it's almost the same thing. Once he was caught and convicted after orchestrating a crime involving rape, murder, and torture, he began playing the same defense, that he was a victim of child abuse, he was the victim of sexual abuse, he was a victim of the conditions of poverty. With Arthur Bomar, it's almost the exact same situation. These types of belief systems exist very clearly with criminals. And with the Long Island serial killer, I think there's a very important comparing and contrasting element that we should pay attention to, and that is animosity towards society. While the Long Island serial killer isn't trying to write letters to various newspapers and creating these little cryptograms for them to solve, the Long Island serial killer definitely seems to show a certain type of animosity toward women. I mean, whatever's happening over there in that part of the world, but most of the women are sex workers who use the internet, and to this day an alternative nickname for the Long Island serial killer is the Craigslist Ripper. Again, serial killers don't always have the most set-in-stone nicknames. It's really just a way that we can remember them and remember some things about their actions, but many of the women are petite, around 4'11". There is one male victim of the Long Island serial killer, but in the sources he is often referred to as a cross-dresser. That's all I will say about that. But, I mean, you could view that as a similarity between the Stone Cold Killer Arthur Bomar and the Long Island serial killer. Both of them have at least one male victim and then female victims. But it shouldn't be downplayed that there is this type of belief system that the serial killer thinks that he or she has the justification, that they have the right to commit these actions. And this also gets into the psychological component of Machiavellianism, where somebody thinks that they are so intelligent and so superior that they don't have to follow the laws of society, that they can weave their own way around them. I do believe that Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer, would be a little bit more impulsive than the Long Island serial killer. The Long Island serial killer has a certain degree of calculation involved, but no matter what, this point here about, oh, you spend 11 years in prison, well now he or she is going to reform his life. No. He or she is going to reform their lives. No. That doesn't happen, whether it's done in an impulsive way or whether it's done in a calculating way. Because anybody who follows a lot of true crime cases, is going to be very much aware of this. They're going to see this very clearly. Sometimes people are in jail, and then 6 months later, they commit another crime. Maybe it's a year later. They're convicted for another crime, even if they've spent 11 years in prison. Sometimes it's drug-related. Sometimes it's domestic abuse. Sometimes it's a sinister and cold, methodical, and calculating plot that they concocted while they were in prison, because once again, they're thinking that society has been unfair to them, therefore they want to get revenge on society, and they aren't afraid of the consequences. But with the serial killer Arthur Bomar, he would go on to kill again, and his most famous victim was known as, or her name was Amy Willard. But if you read some articles about her online, you might see her name written as Amy Ward, but almost the more credible sources, almost all the more credible sources cite her name as Amy Willard, and Arthur Bomar was driving his car behind her on an interstate, and they believe that he tapped her bumper just enough to get the car to pull over, because even though the cars aren't really damaged, there's this little fender bender, or it's really just a gentle tap to the bumper, so then she would pull the car over, and that she would exit the vehicle. And at that point, Arthur Bomar attacked her, and first he struck her with a blunt instrument, which caused her blood spatter to end up on the guardrail, and he did very, very torturous things to Amy Willard. So, one of the more saddening components of this story is he was sent to jail in Nevada. When he was serving those 11 years in prison, that was in Nevada outside of Las Vegas, and the crime against Amy Willard occurred in Pennsylvania, where Arthur Bomar was originally from. And when Arthur Bomar was let out on parole, he violated the terms of his parole and fled the state, and even though he should have been sent back to jail, they were just unable to monitor him or find him, and he was an absconding fugitive, and he went on to kill again. It's quite possible that he committed additional murders in the time period in between his absconding the parole and running and going on the run and the murder of Amy Willard, but we are simply uncertain. But then I'll just read the segment that they have here on the War Report. It is assumed that Amy Willard was murdered by Arthur Bomar on the 20th of June, 1996, in the state of Pennsylvania, as her body was found a couple of days later. However, the authorities did not link the case to Arthur Bomar initially, as Amy Willard's case only began to make headlines when reports of another woman who was missing started circulating. The other woman was named Maria Cabuenos, and she was not reported missing until 1998. Not only was she reported missing, but her car was also used to solve the case. So, I mean, I can provide a little bit of a connecting factor into this. Arthur Bomar committed the murder of Amy Willard using his own vehicle to do that little bumper tap to get her to pull over. He then tried it again with another woman 2 years later, but he wasn't driving his own car. What happened was he was unsuccessful at murdering that victim, so he drove away, and the woman who saw the car and survived was able to memorize the license plate number, and when she gave that to the authorities, the license plate actually belonged to Maria Cabuenos, and that, of course, didn't seem like Maria Cabuenos was driving the car, so the authorities began to put the pieces together, and once they actually found Arthur Bomar, they were able to get his actual vehicle, which was used in the murder of Amy Willard, because there are again some conflicting sources about this. On forensic files, they said that Arthur Bomar had driven over Amy Willard's body with the car, and the oil pan from the car had been burned onto her body, and they matched that oil pan from the car to Arthur Bomar's vehicle, his own vehicle, that is, and that's how he was ultimately convicted, not to mention a handful of other pieces of forensic evidence. See, that's the problem with people like Arthur Bomar. They are just so indifferent to human life that it leads them to committing just obvious errors, but it's because he didn't care. It's because there was no empathy. He showed absolutely no concern for the victims, and I do think that that ties somewhat into the Machiavellian way of thinking, even though with Arthur Bomar, it doesn't seem like he is thinking that he is so much superior to everyone or that he is more intelligent than everyone. He's just simply committing crimes because he thinks that nothing's going to happen to him, or even if something does happen to him, he doesn't care. This is a case of indifference. With the Long Island serial killer, it's also very possible that the same aspects are going on, but the Long Island serial killer definitely seems to be concerned a little bit more for the way in which he is committing the crimes, because he's making a very strong effort not to get caught. I would say that he's indifferent to the well-being of everyone around him, but almost just a little bit more fearful than someone who is as brash as Arthur Bomar. But I would like to read a segment here from My Crime Library that is talking about Arthur Bomar and the death of Amy Willard. Arthur Bomar was sentenced to death by the state of Pennsylvania for the murder of Amy Willard. According to court documents, Arthur Bomar, who had previously been released from prison for murder, had violated his parole countless times and would abduct and beat to death Amy Willard with a tire iron. Right, like, even on forensic files, they suggested that it was most likely a tire iron that he used to beat her with that caused the blood spatter on the guardrail. When I said there was a conflicting element earlier, one article had talked about how he was using a spare oil pan, like not the oil pan that was in the car, but had just a spare oil pan, and that was the blunt instrument that he had used to beat Amy Willard. But that is the only article. That was actually the one from the War Report. As I said, their facts were very inconsistent, and it's quite possible that the author of that article didn't quite comprehend that he had also driven over the body with his car, because what forensic files was very clear about was not only was there an impression of the oil pan, they said it was a burn, meaning that the oil pan was hot. So I just wanted to point out that inconsistency in the news coverage. But yes, Amy Willard was beaten to death with blunt force trauma, most likely a tire iron. The case went cold for a number of years until DNA would tie Arthur Bomar to the scene. Arthur Bomar would be arrested, convicted, and then soon sentenced to death. Arthur Bomar was convicted of the 1998 kidnapping, brutalizing, and fatally beating of star college athlete Amy Willard, and then dumping her naked body in a weed-strewn area north of Philadelphia. He should face the death penalty for the horrific slaying the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has ruled for a second time. And believe it or not, that also sounds like something that is very similar to the Long Island serial killer, as I talked about how the Long Island serial killer would sometimes make efforts to conceal the bodies of the victims, but instead, there were also cases, particularly the murders of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack, when the Long Island serial killer did not do that. Instead, the victims were mutilated, mostly beyond recognition, but it really is quite perplexing why the Long Island serial killer is going through all that effort to try and mutilate the bodies of the victims when they were still identifiable, particularly Jessica Taylor, through a tattoo that she had. Valerie Mack was known as a Jane Doe for a very long time, and it was only until recent years, that DNA was able to identify her as Valerie Mack. But there is the other possible victim of the serial killer Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer, Maria Cabuenos, and as I said, Arthur Bomar was driving her car when he tried to commit a crime against another woman, and that woman memorized the license plate and caused the chain reaction of events that led to his capture. There's an article about Maria Cabuenos in the Associated Press that was written in 1998, Missing Woman's Body Found, and this was written by David Kenny, just citing the source. Maria Cabuenos left for work one March day and never returned. Still, her family believed that eventually she would come home, and they maintained that belief even after police arrested a paroled murderer for driving her car, and even after that man was charged with raping and killing another woman, even after Miss Cabuenos' blood was discovered in the trunk of her car. Now a New Year's Day discovery of skeletal remains in a shallow grave has allowed the tightly knit family to begin mourning. After all this time, we were still shocked. Maria Cabuenos, her 43-year-old sister, said Saturday, "You can tell me it's imagination, but we were still hoping someday, somehow, we would find her alive. The remains were found Thursday by a man walking his dog in the woods of Tinicum Township. The bones were identified from dental records Friday as the remains of the 25-year-old lab technician. She died of a severe, blunt trauma to the back of the skull, authorities said. Among the bones, authorities found a silver ring inscribed with the word Intet, a nickname Miss Cabuenos' younger brother coined when he could not pronounce Princess, an uncle's favorite name for Maria. Philadelphia homicide investigators scoured the thickly wooded crime scene for clues on Saturday. On Saturday, Bucks County District Attorney Alan Rubenstein called Arthur Bomar, a paroled killer charged with the murder of college athlete Amy Willard, the obvious suspect. Bomar was driving Miss Cabuenos' car when he was arrested in June for an unrelated burglary, and a search of Bomar's trailer turned up a watch that relatives said belonged to Miss Cabuenos. Bomar told police he bought the car from a stranger. He has a track record, he has a history, and he was in the car, Rubenstein said. Before he can pursue charges, he said investigators must determine whether Miss Cabuenos was killed in Bucks County or simply dumped there. Oh my goodness, this happens just time and time again. County lines and state lines, and the authorities need to find out whose jurisdiction it is, and this is how a lot of criminals get away with things. Maybe you've heard of some type of offenders who do bad things to children. Well, they flee the state, and then they can get away with it for a while. Or how about other people like Arthur Bomar, who commits this crime in Nevada? He runs away from his parole agreement, and then he goes back to his home state of Pennsylvania, and he's able to roam freely for years. Who knows how many women he did this to? It's really possible that there could be many other victims out there, but there are 3 deaths that are heavily connected to Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer: the 1979 murder of Larry Carrier, the murder of Amy Willard, which we've been discussing, Maria Cabuenos' death. I mean, I'm going to be very blunt with you. I think that he killed her, but as you will see, he was convicted for the murder of Amy Willard, and that's what sent him to death row. Since Maria Cabuenos vanished, her 10 brothers and sisters had driven her 35-minute route to work in Montgomery County over and over. They went up and down the expressway to Atlantic City, a place where Bomar was believed to have frequented. And more times, Marian Cabuenos can count on her fingers, they turned to psychics, who all told the family that Maria was gone. Well, I'm not the biggest fan of psychic detectives, but I'm really glad to hear that they weren't giving any type of false hope. The family is Catholic and were very religious, he explained, but there were times when they were so desperate that they would do anything to try and give them answers, so they would go to psychic after psychic. Arthur Bomar was hospitalized for part of last week after guards at a Delaware County prison found him trying to choke himself with a bedsheet wrapped around his neck and tied to a doorknob. I think that is a clear example of cowardice, and a lot of serial killers end up like this. A lot of convicted murderers end up like this, where they know what they did was illegal, they know what they did was wrong, and they simply do not want to face the punishment. And this goes to show that there's a very strong sense of conscious awareness. I'm a firm believer that, yes, every person who commits a crime like murder is mentally ill. By mentally ill, that mostly just means that they're prone to dangerous and destructive behavior, but not everyone is an unaware psychotic. Not everyone is not completely aware of their mental faculties to the point where they should be given an insanity defense. And this is a clear example. I mean, Arthur Bomar very clearly knew what he was doing, and it goes to show you that he's only attempting something like this, to the best of our knowledge, after he is facing another either life in prison term or death row. And yes, he was convicted and sentenced to death, and that's probably for good reason, because the reason why people want to talk about the case of Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer, is he should never have been let out. Absolutely not. And it's just a failure on part of the justice system in Nevada and the parole boards in Nevada. I would have to say yes. I mean, no matter what reason they had for granting him parole, they should have kept him in jail. And I don't think that we need too many more supporting points for that. His attorney, Mark Much, said that he wants a mental health expert to determine Bomar's fitness to stand trial. That's exactly how it goes as well. Even sometimes people are not only doing the suicide attempts because they genuinely were trying to commit suicide. Sometimes they are building false insanity defenses, and this can be done in much lighter ways. They can just be exhibiting abnormal behaviors. Maybe they'll start, twitching their eyes a little bit and pretending that they aren't completely aware of what's going on. Anything to avoid punishment. And it's absolutely sickening. The Cabuenoses want authorities to charge Bomar with Maria's murder so they can confront the man accused of killing her. I can only wonder what the Long Island serial killer would do under those circumstances, though, about facing the death penalty or life in prison. Would he attempt suicide in a feeble way like Arthur Bomar? I think so, absolutely. I think that that is just typical behavior. Someone who has eluded the authorities for years and doesn't want to go to jail. And as I said, there's a lot more fear in somebody like the Long Island serial killer than other serial killers, like the Zodiac killer, for example, who is just going to murder the victims and walk away from the crime scenes, just leaving everything out in the open. Or how about the Golden State Killer, who would commit crimes for years and years and years with just absolute indifference to life. And I think that those two examples are just people who are less fearful than the Long Island serial killer. But there's another article that is written about Arthur Bomar and his victims, particularly Amy Willard, and it says appeal by Arthur Bomar convicted of killing Amy Willard denied, and this is from Inquirer.com, and this was written by Marie A. Schaefer, just citing the source. A Delaware County court judge denied the latest death penalty appeal from Arthur J. Bomar, who was convicted of killing college athlete Amy Willard in 1996, the district attorney announced Tuesday. Judge Frank T. Hazel issued a 213-page opinion addressing 22 claims by Bomar in his appeal, making any future appeals on the same ground more difficult. The case has already been appealed to the state Supreme Court, District Attorney Jack Whalen said on Tuesday, and called Bomar every parent's worst nightmare. Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, except for maybe the Long Island serial killer, Bomar would be everyone's worst nightmare. But here's a difference, though. Arthur Bomar is going out to select his victims in a very, very deliberate way, and he is tapping the bumper of their cars, forcing them to pull over. The Long Island serial killer is quite possibly using the internet and luring the victims to come to him. So they're putting themselves in the dangerous position, whereas Arthur Bomar is bringing the dangerous situation to the victim. I mean, these are innocent women who are just driving down the highway, and he's tapping the bumper of their car to get them to pull over, and, I mean, both of them are absolutely horribly wrong, but it's so unexpected with the case of Arthur Bomar. I mean, people are just driving home from visiting their friends or going to work or something, and they end up meeting a serial killer. Very, very dangerous behavior, though. At about 1:30 a.m. on June 20th, 1996, Amy Willard was on the interstate driving home to Brookhaven from Mainline Bar, where Bomar bumped her car from behind. The 22-year-old George Mason University lacrosse star pulled over on the southbound Springfield exit off-ramp, and Bomar raped her, then beat her to death and dumped her body in a vacant lot north of Philadelphia. Her car was found running on the off-ramp, and a tree was planted by friends that marks the location of the crime. Bomar was on parole for a murder he committed in Nevada. That was the previously cited murder of Larry Carrier, the police officer. Bomar, who was incarcerated at Cy Green in Waynesburg, is also the main suspect in the death of Maria Cabuenos, age 25, a lab technician who disappeared in 1997. The Associated Press article said 1998, but no matter what, it says they actually do want to make a distinction here. Her body was found in 1998, and she disappeared in 1997, so they might have a little bit more info that her Maria Cabuenos disappeared in 1997, 9 months after Willard's death, when he was arrested in June of 1997 for a parole violation while driving Cabuenos' car. Her body was found in 1998 on New Year's Day in Bucks County. After an 11-day trial, Bomar was convicted and later sentenced for Willard slaying, and that's Amy, not Maria. In the recent appeals, Bomar cited numerous issues, including the ineffective counsel, inappropriate contact by jurors with the sheriff's department, that he was incompetent when he stood trial, that witnesses received consideration when they testified against him, and that his conviction was based on false and misleading DNA evidence. Blah, blah, blah. Hardy har har. This is just legalese here. I mean, these things that you just heard in that. What? Inappropriate contact by jurors, ineffective counsel, witnesses received consideration when they testified against him. I mean, legalese. It seems quite certain that he committed the crimes. But in the United States of America, you have the right to a fair trial. And if there are any types of issues that happen that prevent you from getting the fair trial, then, I mean, that is the way that our legal system works. I mean, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and then if someone is convicted and found guilty, but they didn't get a 100% complete fair trial, oh, there is witness tampering or something, then that's the end of that, and that is the world that we live in. Clearly he understands that this is not the end of the process, and that's the final point that they bring up here in this article, once again from the Inquirer. So, I mean, when it says he understands it's not the end of the process, I think that means that he knows how to manipulate the system. But the Long Island serial killer is probably someone who is less brash, less brazen, maybe even a little more cowardly. The Long Island serial killer is someone who's definitely more methodical, definitely more thoughtful, perhaps has a higher IQ than the Stone Cold Killer Arthur Bomar. And a Long Island serial killer is someone who's going to sit back, wait for the victims to come to him, but we always have to bear in mind because it is an unsolved case. We don't know who the Long Island serial killer was. There could be two people. There could be a group of people. They could be the fixers for the New York social elites where there is some type of thrill kill club going on, and the people who are discarding the bodies aren't even a killer. They're just doing just that. They're discarding the bodies, and there could be some type of very elite criminal behavior going on. It's like some type of sex crime thrill kill club. And I'm only able to say that because there has not been a conviction made. Let's say, for example, that we didn't know who the Stone Cold Killer was, and that they had 5 or 6 or maybe 7 or 8 examples of some guy driving around tapping women on their bumper, and then they would get out of their car and they would be never seen alive again. All right? So if they were using different vehicles, people would be saying the same stuff too, that oh, well, maybe this is some type of thrill kill club where there are these different cars that are going around, or maybe it's even a serial killer gang or something. They could be saying that stuff, but there are really only 3 victims that I've discussed in this episode that are connected to Arthur Bomar. If I can go with my gut instinct, I believe that there are more than just Larry Carrier and Amy Willard and Maria Cabuenos. There could be more victims. It's very, very possible. But I think about how the serial killer gang or a serial killer movement takes off must be exemplified by the smiley face killer theory, where they think that people who are murdered, usually young males in their 20s, are murdered near water sources after nights of heavy drinking. Almost certainly that has been explained by the fact that when someone is around a water source and they are intoxicated, the risk of drowning is so much higher. The risk of death is so much higher if someone is disoriented near a water source. It doesn't even have to be from alcohol if people are dealing with conditions like bipolar disorder and they're having a manic episode, or just even if someone is really angry. This happens all the time, actually. If you go over to the Lord and Arts channel and you watch the show Brain Scratch Searchlight, I talk about the Lord and Arts channel a lot because it's really been very helpful with my understanding of the true crime world. John Lorden was a very big influence on me before starting this program. And you can see that even when people are walking away from an argument, let's say 2 people live together and they get into a fight, one of them decides to take a walk to cool down, they're never seen again. It happens time and time again. Also, unfamiliar territory where people are, let's say their vehicle breaks down and there's some type of car accident, and they decide, well, I'm going to walk to the nearest town to see if there's some type of tow truck or a phone I can call. I got no reception up here. That also leads to disappearances. So a lot of the conditions that we experience in life are not the result of serial killer gangs, serial killer movements, thrill kill clubs, multiple killers, anything. It's just tragedy that strikes. And with the Stone Cold Killer Arthur Bomar, I mean, there are 2 victims that he most likely murdered, including Maria Cabuenos, and then the woman who was able to evade his capture. So it seems like he did this very frequently, but he was unable, or he was only convicted for the murder of Amy Willard, and I don't believe that she was the only person he should have been convicted for. He seems very guilty in the case of Maria Cabuenos, but there could be other victims out there. What do you think about the Stone Cold Killer or the Long Island serial killer? And I know I went off on some big spiel about serial killer movements and thrill kill clubs. I've been very curious about them, but there's even a possibility that a lot of them do not actually exist, and it's just a way of explaining an unsolved case in a way that's using torturous reasoning rather than hard evidence, to quote the historian Patricia Crone. What do you think about any of this? You can put your ideas down in the comment section down below. If you have any comments about either one of these serial killers, I would love to read them. You can also write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, and you can get my personal Facebook, which is in the description box, and BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. One more time, Amazon.com, Killer on a White Horse, the Teespring page, look at the t-shirts, coffee mugs, sweatshirts for sale now, and I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.